Thank you very much.
Okay, and next speaker, respected speaker, is the Linda Hyökki, and the title of her speech is "Whiteness and Finnishness: Past and Present Forms of Racialization." Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm just gonna get straight to it so that we leave discussion and comments later on. I think that there most probably will be some kinds of ideas that come out of this speech in terms of how, for instance, Islamophobia is connected in its ideological forms to Islamophobia in India also. So yeah, let me just start. I'm going to be presenting a paper, or actually it's a part of my PhD thesis, and yeah, I hope that you enjoy. So I often get asked whether there is Islamophobia in Finland and how I, as a convert Muslim, would experience it. I always then take this chance that I'm given to explain that surely there is Islamophobia in Finland, just like everywhere else, but also to show how Finnish Muslims' experiences on hostility and discrimination are connected to the historical experiences of other minorities. Finland has only recently started to recognize the structural racism that minorities have suffered for the past centuries. In national and international narratives, Finland has been framed as this ethnically homogeneous country that arose to independence underneath Swedish and Russian political powers. This whitewashed perception of history has also shadowed not only minority histories, but also the role that global colonialism has played in the making of the Finnish state and nation. The argument of this talk is to show actually how the experience of white Finnish convert Muslims of hostility and discrimination should be analyzed as racial. And I argue here that these experiences have not appeared in a vacuum. Instead, they are embedded in a trajectory of how minorities in Finland have in the past been target of racialization and racist structural discrimination. In the 19th century, nationalism was the dominant ideological basis for European nations' construction of the self. Also in Finland, nationalism affected how knowledge about minorities and the simultaneous formation of the image of the Finns was produced. Nationalistic narratives spread amongst the broader public in the form of textbooks for schools, and these constructed an understanding of the self and collective social identity of Typhelian in-groups and out-groups. And they were at the same time forming the contrast with the other. The questions were asked, who are we and who are we not? So this making of the Finnish nation quickly showed the place of the other in the society, and ethnic minorities were placed in the margins. Despite that they had lived for centuries in what geographically was understood as Finland, they were not Finnish. Throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries, the Sami and the Roma were problematized in economic, social, cultural, and security-related terms. At the same time, the biological understanding of race was tied to what has been named ethnoculturalization. As we can argue, the racism and discrimination faced by the Sami and the Roma can be seen as part of forming a racial category of a Finn as white Christian. The Sami and the Roma were dominantly targets of what the sociologists Nassar Mir and Tariq Modood have called cultural racism. I quote, "While biological racism is the antipathy, exclusion, and unequal treatment of people on the basis of their physical appearance or other imputed physical differences, cultural racism builds on biological racism, a further discourse which evokes cultural differences from a civilized norm to vilify, marginalize, or demand cultural assimilation from otherized groups." The nationalist and intellectually, end of quote, of course. The nationalist and intellectually inspired Fennoman movement was one of the main drivers in the making of the Finnish nation. Hence, while the Fennoman narrative favored the white Christian majority as culturally superior to other groups, to argue for a shared heritage as a basis of a nation. This was strongly reflected in the minority governance measures, whose objective was to assimilate the minorities and normalize them culturally. Notions of race and culture were intertwined, and the Sami and the Roma people became targets of cultural racism. This meant that their cultural practices, heavily essentialized through culture talk, were seen as inherent group traits. On the one hand, the Fennoman movement's significance in constructing a culturally homogeneous Finland was underlined by the global influences of eugenics. The nomadic Sami were consequently constructed as a hindrance to the civilizing process of the Finnish nation at large. During the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, linguistic knowledge about the Sami language disclosed that Finnish and the Sami languages actually were related. Consequently, the otherization of the Sami people turned to biological race as a marker of difference. Hence, the Sami were classified as the racially lower category and characterized as a threat to the majority society and its development. Especially after the Second World War, this resulted, among other things, in interventions by educational institutions in Sami pupils and their families' diets and physical exercises for the Sami to develop in the direction needed favorable according to Finnish healthcare and anthropological knowledge. The forced settlement of the Sami population went hand in hand with the colonization of the Sami lands. These measures resulted in restrictions of the Sami people's practicing of their traditional livelihood, meaning reindeer herding and fishing, which had been primarily connected to their nomadic lifestyle. On the other hand, essentialization and culture talk regarding the Roma population produced negative stereotypes used to stigmatize the Roma and implement repressive policy measures. Policy recommendations on forced settlement and forced Christianization were set to practice with the justification that the Roma could be turned into useful workers, docile, and virtuous members of the society. Being a non-Christian community, back then, the Roma was considered a religious problem and hence forcibly Christianized. However, they were also considered an economic problem and therefore forcibly settled. Because of the ethnocultural turn in minority governance, the Roma were finally also considered a cultural problem, which resulted in the forced education of the Roma children for their own sake, so far that they would become alienated from their native cultural practices. Moreover, governance policies were justified by the necessity of protecting the non-Roma population from the dangers allegedly posed by the Roma culture that could corrupt and endanger the decency of the majority society. With this historical background in mind, I want to argue that the research on Finnish convert Muslims and their experiences on anti-Muslim racism must be situated in the larger context of the histories of other minorities in the country. This is because the experiences of converts, they do not occur in a vacuum. They reflect the historical continuities of otherization and racial hierarchies in Finland, to which minorities such as the Sami people and the Roma have been subjugated. As I have shown, race and whiteness are topics that the majority society has contested for the past 2 centuries regarding how they have positioned ethnic minorities in the social structure. Finns are among many other Europeans who have been socialized with a collective memory of their civilization being marked by a white Judeo-Christian heritage. In contrast, Islam and Muslims have been always portrayed as the ultimate antithesis. For the broader Finnish public who have had little contact with Muslims, it seems still challenging to grasp Muslims as non-immigrants, non-foreigners, and as white. Since most Muslims in Finland have a migratory background, Islam has long been perceived as an immigrant religion. Hence, it could be argued that the lack of contact, possibly due to the small size of the Muslim population, can subsequently affect how the broader public perceives Muslims as non-white. However, Such misrecognition of the racial and ethnic heterogeneity of Muslims living in Finland is embedded in the bias about normative whiteness and Finnishness. This bias has been socially constructed in the national narratives throughout the centuries, for which ethnic minorities have paid the price. It would be too short-sighted to start an inquiry on the past and the present perceptions of the Muslims and Islam in Finland from the gradual arrival of the newer ethnic Muslim communities in the 1990s. This is despite the Muslim community's demographic profile being mainly of immigrant origin. Going beyond such trajectories is necessary since the convert experience must consider concepts of Finnishness and race from another perspective. Even though experiences on anti-Muslim racism, they can overlap with those of, I'm talking about the experiences of the converts, with those of, for instance, Muslims of Somali descent, othering and anti-Muslim racism get new dimensions in the everyday lives of converts. After their conversion, converts are often forced to negotiate their own and others' ideas of Finnishness, which is an identity marker with which they were born as members of the so-called white Finnish community. Today, Muslims have become in Finland one of the most targeted groups of racial othering. While I have previously used the term Islamophobia in my work, I have always defined it as anti-Muslim racism. In academia, both terms are widely used depending on what angle to the study the phenomenon of this phenomenon is emphasized. The political scientist Farid Hafez has, for example, categorized Islamophobia studies according to the theoretical frameworks they follow. These are the prejudice-guided approach, the post-colonial approach, and the decolonial approach. At the same time, the latter two emphasize anti-Muslim racism as a term, while the prejudice school employs the term Islamophobia. Islamophobia is there, hence, for instance, defined as a manifestation of both religious and racial prejudice. For the proponents of the anti-Muslim racism term, racialization plays a role on the one hand in producing and reproducing racial categories of the post-colonial era, and on the other hand, in maintaining the once created power structures. When it comes to studying converts, employing the concept of racialization explains why we can call out anti-Muslim racism while it is clear that Muslim is not a race. Instead, it is a constructed racial category to which similar significance is given in categorizing individuals and conducting everyday interactions. Converts in Finland could be considered phenotypically the same as the majority non-Muslim population. Their situation can be maybe compared to Bosnian Muslims, who were identified as a racial group by people who were phenotypically, linguistically, and culturally the same. Moreover, the experiences of Finnish convert Muslims and on the anti-Muslim racism have also been reported in research on converts from other Western contexts. So we have overlapping in experiences. Namely, there is this thing called losing one's whiteness, which we then translate in the Finnish context to losing one's Finnishness. It is also important to note that despite the term anti-Muslim racism focusing semantically on individuals, manifestations of this phenomenon can be observed as animosity towards both the religion and the people. At the same time, for the latter, the people, it is sufficient that an individual is merely perceived as a Muslim. Hatred towards religion per se or religious practices can be observed, for instance, within political debates on the muezzin calls or restrictions regarding Muslim women's swimming attire on public beaches. Yet, especially in the latter case, the discriminatory practice targets the individual Muslim. She is considered, we're talking about Muslim women, so they are considered as the embodiment of what their religion signify in terms of values. This overlapping is what Mir and Mudud have exactly argued finally constitutes the racialization of Muslims. Whereas different Sami peoples living in Finland are culturally and linguistically kindred, and the Finnish Roma are ethnically homogeneous, the Finnish Muslim community is ethnically, linguistically, religiously, and politically heterogeneous. Nevertheless, anti-Muslim racism racializes all Muslims, despite their ethnic or racial background, into this one racial category of Muslim. Thus, as Nasar Mir explains, signs of race, culture, and belonging are amalgamated so that religion is given a new sociological relevance because of how it is tied up with issues of community identity, stereotyping, socioeconomic location, political conflict, and so forth. In the Finnish context, normative whiteness and normative Finnishness go hand in hand, yet modified in their conceptualization according to the socio-political circumstances of the present society. Both concepts are constructed by specific cultural, including religious, characteristics. Convert Muslims often face hostility that manifests itself in denying their native cultural identity, merely based on their religiosity as Muslims. The two are in the anti-Muslim racist discourse seen as exclusive. Of course, it's impossible to generalize, but what I have observed throughout my PhD work, where I did field work with Finnish convert Muslims, in terms of perceptions of converts by those who already have anti-Muslim sentiments, it can be said that in the anti-Muslim racist discourse, converts are viewed as foreign once they embrace the religion of Islam, and especially if they start adhering to certain religious dress practices like the hijab. This is simply because anti-Muslim racism and the racialization of Muslims they are both connected to the understanding that Muslims are inherently different from non-Muslims. Hence, even convert Muslims are racialized. They are categorized just in the same way as Muslims of color as the other, and attributed similar characteristics that are used to depict them as inferior in opposition to their non-Muslim fellow citizens. While one can argue that this means losing their whiteness, convert Muslims are discursively excluded from the imagination of us in the Finnish national and cultural context, and they become victimized for racially motivated hate incidents and discrimination, similarly to Muslims of color. Moreover, considering the perpetual global coloniality, we can understand how Finnish Muslim converts can also be affected by it. The same anti-Muslim racism inevitably influences them as it does influence ethnic Muslims. But attempting to apply an immigration framework to the study of convert Muslims in Finland who are socially and politically and economically different from the migrant Muslim, it's a little bit irresponsible in my opinion. The social status of convert Muslims requires attention when analyzing various Muslim communities' situation in the Finnish society concerning whiteness, especially when their otherness is visible. In this talk, my objective has been to show how ethnic minorities in Finland have been targeted by cultural racism and racialization. Employing racialization and understanding Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism in the study of Finnish convert Muslims' experiences provides a space where conversations about race can move beyond the black and white paradigm, and we can pinpoint the porous boundaries of Finnishness and whiteness, boundaries produced and reproduced in the narratives of us and them. For centuries, these narratives have taken place only by changing the target of the racial othering, moving from the Sami and the Roma to Muslims. However, as this religious scholar Maurits Berger notes, historical narratives have their meanings anchored in certain epochs and respective audiences of the time they were produced. Followingly, I would argue that these narratives can be brought up to date, they can be rewritten and revised, considering all the marginal voices that have until now been ignored. As a scholar activist myself, I hope that our generation can produce a new collective memory due to the rising awareness about the whitewashing of Finland's history. This new, decolonized collective memory would recognize minorities and give them their due value as makers of the past and the present-day societies in Europe. Now, this talk was a small part of such an endeavor, bringing forth for the first time a critical perspective from within the Muslim experiences on race, whiteness, and normative Finnishness. Thank you so much. And we continue to the next talk, I guess. Thank you.